At 80 years old, I thought I had forgotten how to feel true terror, until last week when my granddaughter Sarah asked me why I always check her bedroom door 3 times before saying goodnight. The words froze in my throat because suddenly I was 12 again, lying in that cramped room in our 1950s farmhouse, listening to the floorboards creak as footsteps approached my bed. My name is Victoria Simons, and for 68 years I've carried a secret that nearly destroyed our family forever. You might wonder why an old woman like me would choose to tell this story now, why I would risk shattering the peaceful image of our close-knit family that everyone in town still remembers. The truth is, I'm running out of time, and there are things that need to be said before I'm gone. Things about the house that still stands on Maple Street, where tourists sometimes stop to admire the white picket fence and the rose garden my mother Eleanor tended so carefully. They see a picture of 1950s perfection, but they don't know about the nightmare that played out behind those lace curtains. My 3 brothers were supposed to protect me. Robert at 17 was already working alongside our father Thomas at the mill, strong enough to lift grain sacks that would break most men's backs. James at 15 had inherited our father's stern jaw and piercing blue eyes that could silence troublemakers with just a look. Edward, the youngest of my brothers at 14, was quiet and thoughtful, the one who helped me with my arithmetic homework and shared his penny candy when mother wasn't looking. These were the boys who taught me to fish in Miller's Creek, who built me a tire swing in the old oak tree, who promised they would always keep me safe from harm. But when darkness fell and our parents retired to their room at the far end of the hall, my brothers became strangers. The house would settle into its nightly routine. Father checking the locks, mother banking the fire in the kitchen stove, the soft murmur of their voices discussing the day's events before silence claimed our home. That's when my real terror would begin, when I would lie rigid under my thin quilt, praying for morning to come quickly. For months, I lived in 2 different worlds. During the day, I was just Victoria, the quiet girl who helped mother with the washing, who fed the chickens and gathered eggs, who sat in the front pew at Sunday service while Reverend Matthews preached about the sanctity of family. But when the sun went down, I became someone else entirely, a frightened child who had learned that the people you trust most can become your greatest source of fear. What none of us could have predicted was that everything would change on a cold night. A night that would shatter our family's foundation and leave us all wondering if some wounds can ever truly heal. A night when secrets that had been buried in darkness would finally see the light, and the consequences would echo through our lives for decades to come. The truth about what happened that night, about what my father discovered and the choice he had to make, about the words that were spoken and the threats that were made, that truth changed everything. And now, as I watch my own granddaughter sleep peacefully in her bed, I know it's time to tell you exactly what happened in that little house on Maple Street all those years ago. When I look at my grandchildren now, Michael with his messy brown hair who's always building things with his hands, Sarah who asks a million questions about everything she sees, and little Rose who still believes the world is made of fairy tales and happy endings, I see the childhood I should have had. I see trust in their eyes when they look at the adults around them. I see the way they sleep soundly at night, never once checking to make sure their bedroom door is locked, never listening for footsteps in the hallway. Michael is 14 now, the same age Edward was back then. When I watch him laugh with his friends or complain about his chores, I'm struck by how carefree he is, how he moves through the world without that constant fear I carried everywhere. Sarah, at 12, reminds me so much of myself at that age. Curious, eager to please, trusting everyone around her completely. And Rose, sweet Rose at 8 years old, still runs to me for hugs without any hesitation, without any of that careful watchfulness I learned so young. I've made sure they know they can tell me anything. Anything at all. When Sarah scraped her knee last summer and was afraid to tell her mother because she'd been climbing the fence she wasn't supposed to climb, she came to me instead. When Michael got in trouble at school for fighting and was worried about disappointing his father, he sat at my kitchen table and told me the whole story while I made him grilled cheese sandwiches. These are normal childhood problems, the kind of troubles that get solved with Band-Aids and honest conversations. That's what children should worry about: scraped knees and forgotten homework, and whether their friends will still like them tomorrow. They shouldn't lie awake at night wondering if today will be the day someone finally believes them. They shouldn't learn to make themselves small and invisible hoping that if they're quiet enough, maybe they'll be safe. They shouldn't carry secrets that feel too big and too terrible for their small bodies to hold. That's why I'm telling you this story. Not for sympathy, not for attention, but because somewhere out there is another child who thinks they're alone, who thinks no one will believe them, who thinks this is just how families work. I'm telling this story because I was that child once, and I know how heavy that silence can become. I know what it feels like to scream for help on the inside while smiling on the outside, to pretend everything is fine when your whole world is falling apart. Every night when I tuck my grandchildren into bed, when I kiss their foreheads and tell them I love them, I'm keeping a promise I made to that 12-year-old girl I used to be. I promised her that no child in our family would ever suffer the way she did. I promised her that the silence would finally be broken. Please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if this story touches you, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Our house on Maple Street wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a simple 2-story wooden structure that my father had built with his own hands when he first married my mother. The floors were made of wide pine planks that had been worn smooth by years of bare feet and daily scrubbing. Every board had its own particular creak, and after living there for 12 years, I knew exactly which spots to avoid if I wanted to move through the house quietly. The smell of my mother's cornbread seemed to live in those walls permanently. She baked it fresh every other day in our old cast-iron Dutch oven, and the scent would drift through every room, mixing with the smell of the wood polish she used on the furniture and the faint trace of my father's pipe tobacco that clung to his work clothes. On winter evenings, when the oil lamp burned low in the main room and the fire crackled in our stone fireplace, it felt like the kind of home you'd see painted on Christmas cards. But our house had a problem that most families didn't have to deal with. There simply weren't enough bedrooms for all of us children. My parents had the master bedroom at the end of the hall, and there was one other bedroom that we 4 siblings had to share. Mother had tried to make it work by hanging a sheet down the middle of the room to give me some privacy, but it was still just one room with 2 sets of bunk beds and a small window that looked out over the vegetable garden. My father Thomas was the kind of man who commanded respect without having to raise his voice. He stood just over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders from years of loading grain at the mill, and when he walked into a room, people noticed. He worked 6 days a week, coming home each evening with flour dust in his hair and calluses on his hands that never seemed to heal completely. The other men in town looked up to him, asked his opinion on everything from crop rotations to local politics. At home, we children knew better than to argue when he made a decision or to complain when he assigned us chores. Mother Eleanor was his complete opposite. Where father was commanding, she was gentle. Where he made his presence known, she seemed to fade into the background. She had been raised to believe that a woman's job was to keep the house running smoothly and to support her husband in all things, no questions asked. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and tending to her garden. When problems arose between us children, she would often just sigh and say that we needed to work it out ourselves, that she couldn't be expected to solve every little disagreement. My oldest brother Robert had inherited all of father's confidence, but none of his wisdom. At 17, he was already working part-time at the mill and had started talking about taking over the family business someday. He had this way of walking that made him seem bigger than he actually was, chest puffed out, chin raised like he owned every room he entered. The younger kids in town looked up to him, but I had started to notice something different in his eyes when he looked at me, something that made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't explain. James, my middle brother, was 15 and had always been Robert's shadow. Whatever Robert did, James wanted to do too. Whatever Robert said, James would repeat. He had developed this habit of making little comments about my appearance, about how I was growing up, about how I was starting to look more like a woman than a little girl. When I would ask him to stop, he would just laugh and say he was only teasing, that I needed to learn to take a joke. Edward, at 14, was the quietest of my brothers. He spent most of his time reading or whittling small animals out of pieces of wood that father brought home from the mill. He rarely spoke unless someone asked him a direct question, and even then, his answers were usually just a few words. I had always felt closest to Edward because he seemed gentle, like mother. He would help me with difficult arithmetic problems and never made fun of me when I didn't understand something the first time. The first night it happened, I had been asleep for what felt like hours. It was late fall, and the temperature had dropped enough that Mother had added an extra quilt to each of our beds. I remember waking up confused, thinking maybe I was having a bad dream. My mind felt foggy, like when you wake up in the middle of the night and can't remember where you are for a few seconds. But this wasn't a dream. I was lying on my side, facing the wall, and I could feel that someone was in my bed. At first, I thought maybe Edward had gotten cold and climbed in with me, something we had done when we were much younger. But as my mind cleared and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized this was something entirely different. I could hear whispered voices, my brothers talking to each other in tones so low I couldn't make out the words. My body went completely rigid. Every muscle tensed as I tried to understand what was happening, tried to make sense of why my brothers were in my bed, why they were touching me in ways that felt wrong, why they were doing things that made my stomach feel sick and my heart race with fear. I wanted to scream, wanted to call out for Mother and Father, but my voice had disappeared completely. And as I lay there frozen, unable to move or speak or even breathe properly, I found myself praying to God for the first time in my life with real desperation. I prayed that someone would hear what was happening. I prayed that someone would come save me. I prayed that when morning came, this would all turn out to be the worst nightmare I had ever had. But morning came, and it wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it was just the beginning. 23 years later, when I was a mother myself living in a small apartment across town with my husband Frank, I got a phone call that brought all those memories rushing back. It was 2 a.m, and the sound of the telephone ringing in our kitchen made my heart jump the way sudden noises always did. Frank rolled over and mumbled something about who could be calling at such an hour, but I was already out of bed, hurrying down the hallway in my nightgown. It was my daughter Clara. She was 16 then, spending the night at her friend Janet's house for what was supposed to be a fun sleepover. But when I heard her voice on the other end of the line, shaky and small, I knew something was terribly wrong. "Mama," she whispered into the phone, "can you come get me? Something happened, and I need to come home." I didn't ask questions. I threw on the first clothes I could find, grabbed my car keys, and drove across town in my old Ford while Frank stayed home with our 2 younger children. When I pulled up to Janet's house, Clara was already waiting on the front porch, still in her pajamas with a coat thrown over them, her overnight bag clutched in her hands. She climbed into the passenger seat and immediately started crying. Not the dramatic tears of a teenager upset about friend drama, but the kind of deep, gut-wrenching sobs that come from somewhere much deeper. I didn't push her to talk during the drive home. I just reached over and took her hand while I steered with the other, letting her know I was there. Once we got home, she told me what had happened. Janet's older brother had come home drunk from a party with some of his friends. They had been making comments about the girls, saying things that made Clara uncomfortable, touching her arm when she tried to walk past them in the hallway. When she tried to tell Janet about it, Janet just laughed and said her brother was harmless, that Clara was being too sensitive. But Clara knew what she felt. She knew when something was wrong, when someone was making her feel unsafe, and she trusted that feeling enough to call me. She trusted that I would believe her and come get her without asking her to explain herself or prove that her concerns were valid. That night, I sat on the edge of her bed while she told me the whole story. I watched her face in the dim light from the hallway, saw the way she kept looking toward the door as if she needed to make sure it was still open, still providing an escape route if she needed one. When she finally fell asleep around 4 a.m, I stayed right there in the chair beside her bed. I watched her breathe, watched the tension slowly leave her face as sleep took over. Every hour or so, she would stir and reach out, checking to make sure I was still there. Each time, I would take her hand and squeeze it gently, letting her know she wasn't alone. That's when I understood something I had never been able to put into words before. Sitting there in that quiet room, watching my daughter sleep peacefully because she knew someone believed her and protected her, I realized that this was what I had needed all those years ago. Not someone to fix everything or make the hurt go away, but simply someone to believe me, someone to stay with me, someone to make sure I wasn't alone with my fear. I had made a promise to myself when Clara was born, though I didn't fully understand it at the time. I promised that my children would never have to carry their burdens alone the way I had. They would never have to wonder if anyone would believe them. They would never have to lie awake at night hoping someone would care enough to notice their pain. That promise came from the little girl inside me who had prayed so desperately for someone to save her. The little girl who had trusted her brothers to protect her, and instead learned that the people closest to you could become the ones who hurt you most. The little girl who had spent months believing that what was happening to her was somehow her fault, that maybe she had done something to deserve it. As I sat there watching Clara sleep, I thought about that 12-year-old version of myself, and I whispered to her across all those years that I was finally keeping the promise I had made. No child in my family would ever suffer in silence. No child would ever have to face their fears alone. But that night in 1953, when I was still that frightened little girl, I had no way of knowing that help would eventually come, or that the silence would ever be broken. After that first night, I kept hoping it was over. I told myself it had been some kind of terrible mistake, that my brothers would realize what they had done was wrong, and it would never happen again. For 3 days, everything seemed normal. We went about our usual routines, morning chores, helping Mother with the washing, sitting around the dinner table listening to Father talk about his day at the mill. My brothers acted like nothing had changed. They teased me about my pigtails, argued over who got the last piece of cornbread, complained about their assigned chores just like always. But on the 4th night, I heard those footsteps again. The same careful, quiet padding across the wooden floor. The same whispered voices outside my door. My whole body went cold as I realized this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. This was going to keep happening. Night after night they came. Sometimes it was all 3 of them together, sometimes just Robert and James, occasionally just Robert alone. They had worked out some kind of system between them, taking turns keeping watch to make sure our parents didn't wake up. Edward, who I had always thought was the gentle one, turned out to be the best at listening for sounds from our parents' room. He could hear Father's snoring change rhythm, or Mother getting up to use the chamber pot long before the rest of us would notice. I tried everything I could think of to make it stop. I started going to bed fully dressed instead of in my nightgown, thinking maybe that would discourage them. It didn't. I tried staying awake all night, thinking I could somehow prevent it from happening if I was alert and ready. But exhaustion would eventually take over, and I would wake up to find them there anyway. I even tried sleeping on the floor beside my bed, but Robert just pulled me back up onto the mattress and told me to stop being difficult. The worst part wasn't just what they were doing to me. It was the way they acted about it during the day. Robert would catch my eye across the breakfast table and smile in a way that made my stomach turn. James would make little comments about how I was becoming such a good girl, and how proud he was of me for learning to be so quiet at night. Edward would leave small gifts on my pillow, a carved wooden bird, a pretty stone he had found by the creek, as if these tokens could somehow make up for what he was participating in when the sun went down. I became 2 completely different people. During the day, I was still Victoria, the obedient daughter who helped with household chores and sat quietly during family prayers. But inside, I was disappearing a little more each day. I stopped looking forward to anything. Food lost its taste. Playing with the barn cats or helping Mother tend her vegetable garden felt like I was just going through the motions, pretending to be a normal child when I knew I wasn't normal anymore. The hardest part was watching my mother. Eleanor had always been observant about small things. She noticed when one of us was coming down with a cold before we even felt sick ourselves, or when we were worried about something at school. She could tell when James was lying about finishing his homework, just by the way he avoided her eyes. She knew when Edward was upset about something because he would whittle more aggressively, sending wood shavings flying across the kitchen table. But somehow she didn't notice that I had stopped eating properly. She didn't notice that I flinched whenever one of my brothers touched my shoulder or brushed past me in the hallway. She didn't notice that I had dark circles under my eyes from lying awake terrified every night, or that I had started jumping at sudden noises during the day. Or maybe she did notice, and she just chose not to see it. There were moments when I caught her watching me with this strange expression on her face, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. Once, when I was helping her hang laundry on the line behind the house, she asked me if everything was all right, if there was anything I wanted to talk to her about. For just a second, I thought about telling her everything. The words were right there in my throat, ready to spill out. But then Robert appeared around the corner of the house, offering to help carry the heavy laundry basket, and the moment passed. Mother smiled at him and thanked him for being such a helpful son, and I realized that even if I did tell her, she probably wouldn't believe me. Robert was her golden boy, the responsible oldest child who helped father at the mill and never gave them any trouble. James was the charming one who could make her laugh with his silly jokes and impressions of the neighbors. Edward was her baby, the quiet, sensitive boy who still let her ruffle his hair and call him her little artist. Who was I compared to them? Just the only girl, the one who was supposed to help with cooking and cleaning and not cause any problems. The one who was supposed to be grateful for having 3 big brothers to look out for her. As the weeks turned into months, I started to understand that my mother's silence wasn't accidental. She had to know something was wrong. She had to notice the way I had changed, the way I moved through the house like I was trying to make myself invisible. But acknowledging it would mean having to do something about it, and doing something about it would mean admitting that her sons, her precious boys, were capable of something terrible. So she chose not to see. She chose to believe that everything in our happy little family was exactly as it should be. And that choice felt like a second betrayal, almost worse than what my brothers were doing to me. Because at least they were children too, young and stupid and thinking they could get away with anything. But she was the mother. She was supposed to protect me. She was supposed to notice when something was wrong and fix it. Instead, she just kept making her cornbread and tending her garden and pretending that her daughter wasn't falling apart right in front of her eyes. Then came the night that changed everything. It was mid-October, and the weather had turned cold enough that we needed extra blankets on our beds. Father had been working longer hours at the mill, trying to finish processing the last of the harvest before winter set in. He had been coming home exhausted, eating his dinner in relative silence, and going to bed earlier than usual. But that particular night, something was different. I had heard him tossing and turning in his bed, the old mattress springs creaking as he shifted position again and again. Mother had gotten up once to check on him, and I heard her asking in a whisper if he was feeling all right, if there was anything she could get him. Just worried about the Henderson account, he had mumbled back. Can't seem to shut my mind off tonight. Around midnight, I heard my brothers begin their usual routine. Robert had developed this system where he would tap softly on the wall between our room and theirs to signal when the coast was clear. James would respond with 2 soft taps back. Then they would wait exactly 5 minutes before making their move, giving our parents time to fall back into deep sleep. But as they made their way across the room toward my bed, we all heard something that made us freeze. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, careful footsteps that were definitely not Mother's lighter step. Father was up, moving around the house. My brothers immediately scattered back to their own beds, and I pulled my quilt up to my chin, trying to slow my racing heart. We all lay there in the darkness, listening as Father's footsteps moved down the hallway toward the kitchen. We heard the hand pump squeaking as he got himself a drink of water, heard him moving around for a few minutes, probably checking the doors and windows one more time before coming back to bed. But instead of going straight back to his room, his footsteps paused outside our door. I held my breath, wondering if he had heard something, if he suspected that we had been awake when we should have been sleeping. The doorknob turned slowly, and a thin slice of light from his oil lamp cut through the darkness of our room. "Everything all right in here?" he asked quietly, his voice still rough with sleep. "Yes, sir," Robert answered immediately, his voice perfectly calm and normal. "We're all asleep." Father stood there for what felt like forever, his lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls. I could sense him looking around the room, checking on each of us. When the light passed over my bed, I kept my eyes closed and tried to breathe evenly, the way you do when you're genuinely asleep. Finally, he seemed satisfied. "Good night then," he said softly and pulled the door closed again. We all waited until we heard his bedroom door close and the house settle back into silence. But something had shifted that night. For the first time since this had all started, my brothers seemed nervous. They whispered to each other for a while, but they didn't come near my bed. Eventually, I fell into the first peaceful sleep I had had in months. I thought maybe Father's unexpected appearance had scared them enough to stop. For the next 2 nights, they left me alone, and I started to hope that this nightmare might finally be over. But on the 3rd night, they were back. And this time, they were more determined than ever to make up for lost time. The night everything changed started exactly like all the others. Father had been restless after dinner, pacing around the house and checking the locks twice. The mill had been having problems with their main grinding wheel, and the worry lines around his eyes had deepened over the past week. Around midnight, I heard Robert's signal, 2 soft taps against the wall. James responded back, and they began their usual 5-minute wait to make sure our parents were asleep. But tonight felt different. My brothers were whispering more urgently than usual, and there was a tension in the air that made my stomach clench with dread. When they finally approached my bed, Robert was rougher than he had ever been before. Instead of his usual careful movements, he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the edge of the mattress. When I tried to resist, James clamped his hand over my mouth, so hard I could barely breathe. "Stop fighting," Robert hissed, his voice carrying a threat that terrified me more than anything he had done before. But something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the extra force, maybe it was just that I couldn't endure one more night of this nightmare. When James pressed his hand against my mouth, I bit down hard on his fingers. He jerked back with a sharp gasp, and in that moment of freedom, I did something I had never done before. I cried out, not a scream exactly, but a desperate sob that escaped before I could stop it. We all froze, listening for any sign that our parents had heard. For several seconds, there was nothing but silence. Robert started to relax, reaching for me again. That's when we heard the footsteps. These weren't the slow, sleepy steps of someone getting water. These were quick, determined footsteps of someone who was wide awake and moving with purpose. Father was coming, and he was coming fast. My brothers scattered toward their beds, but they weren't quick enough. The door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, leaving a dent that would remain there for years. Father stood in the doorway with his oil lamp raised high, his eyes completely alert and filled with something I had never seen before. He took in the scene with one sweeping glance. Me sitting on my bed with tears streaming down my face, my nightgown twisted and my hair disheveled. Robert frozen halfway between my bed and his own. James tangled in his blankets with panic written across his face. Edward pressed against the wall with guilty, terrified eyes. "What in God's name is going on here?" Father's voice was low and dangerous. Robert tried to lie. "Nothing. Pa Victoria had a bad dream, and we were just trying to comfort her." Father's eyes moved slowly from Robert to James to Edward, then settled on me. For the first time in months, an adult was really looking at me, really seeing me. "Victoria," he said, his voice gentler but still carrying steel. "Come here." I walked toward him on shaking legs, and he did something he had never done before. He stepped in front of me, positioning his body between me and my brothers like a shield. That simple act of protection broke something open inside me that had been locked away for months. "Tell me what's been happening," he said quietly. The words poured out then, months of fear and shame and confusion spilling out all at once. I told him about the first night, about how it kept happening, about how I had tried to make it stop but couldn't. As I spoke, I watched Father's face transform from confusion to understanding to horror, and finally to a rage so pure it seemed to change the very air in the room. When I finished, Father was quiet for a long moment. His jaw worked like he was chewing words too bitter to swallow. When he finally spoke, his voice was terrifyingly controlled. "Robert, James, Edward, get out of those beds and stand up." My brothers obeyed immediately, standing against the far wall like condemned men. They looked smaller and younger than I had ever seen them. "Look at me," Father commanded. "All of you." Robert tried to maintain his defiance, but even he couldn't hold Father's gaze. James was already crying. Edward stared at the floor, trembling. Father's voice rose then, filling the room with fury that seemed to shake the house itself. "You will not touch her again. Do you hear me? You will not go near her. You will not speak to her unless absolutely necessary. Because if I ever catch you hurting her again, I will drag the 3 of you to Sheriff Morrison myself and tell him exactly what kind of sons I raised. And after he's done with you, after the whole town knows what you've done, you will no longer be sons of mine. You will no longer carry the Simon's name." The threat hung in the air like smoke. In our small town, reputation was everything, and Father was promising to destroy theirs completely. Robert made one last desperate attempt. "Pa, you don't understand. She wanted Father moved faster than I had ever seen him move, grabbing Robert by his nightshirt. If you finish that sentence, I will forget you're my son right here and right now. Victoria is 12 years old. 12. There is nothing she could have wanted that would make any of this her fault. He released Robert and stepped back. All three of you will sleep in the barn tonight. Tomorrow we're having a long conversation about how this family works from now on. My brothers gathered their clothes and left without argument. James was still crying. Edward looked sick. Robert's face was a mask of humiliation and rage. After they left, Father sat down in the chair beside my bed. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening. I'm sorry I didn't protect you the way I should have. That night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. I slept knowing someone had finally seen me, someone had chosen to believe me, and someone had decided that protecting me was more important than protecting my brothers. The abuse stopped that night and never happened again. Robert became resentful and moved out the day he turned 18. James withdrew completely, becoming quiet and serious. Edward couldn't meet my eyes anymore and found excuses to avoid me. Mother never spoke about what happened, returning to her routine as if nothing had changed. But Father kept his word. He converted the storage room into a proper bedroom just for me. He checked on me at night in a way that felt protective, not intrusive. Most importantly, he taught me that silence is poison, that speaking the truth is the only way to stop the hurt from continuing. His fury that night didn't erase my scars or undo the months of fear I had endured. But it did something just as important: it stopped the bleeding. It drew a line and said this far, and no further. And for a 12-year-old girl who had been drowning in silence, that was everything. Now, at 80 years old, I understand that the worst thing that ever happened to me also shaped me into the woman I became. Every time I see a child who seems too quiet, too careful, too eager to please, I pay attention. Every time I notice an adult who flinches at unexpected touch or who has trouble making eye contact, I remember what it feels like to carry secrets that feel too heavy for your body. I became a teacher after I married Frank, partly because I wanted to work with children, but mostly because I wanted to be the adult I had needed when I was 12. Over 30 years in various classrooms, I learned to spot the signs that other people missed or chose to ignore. The little girl who always wore long sleeves, even in summer heat. The boy who never wanted to go home after school, who found reasons to stay late and help clean erasers or organize supplies. The children who seemed older than their years, who had learned too early that the world wasn't always safe. I never asked direct questions, that wasn't my place, and it wasn't always safe for the children involved. But I made sure they knew my classroom was a place where they could talk if they needed to, where someone would listen without judgment, where their words would be believed. I kept granola bars in my desk drawer for kids who came to school hungry. I had extra sweaters for children who showed up underdressed for the weather. Small things, maybe, but sometimes small acts of care can plant seeds that grow into something bigger. The hardest part was watching mothers who reminded me of my own mother Eleanor. Women who seemed determined not to see what was happening right in front of them, who chose the comfort of denial over the difficulty of action. I wanted to shake them sometimes, to tell them that their silence was its own form of harm. But I had learned that you can't force people to face truths they're not ready to handle. What I could do was be different. When my own children came to me with problems, no matter how small or silly they seemed, I listened. When my grandchildren tell me about conflicts with friends or fears about growing up, I take their concerns seriously. I broke the cycle of silence that my mother had passed down to her, just as her mother had probably passed it down to her. That's the real victory, I think. Not that my father's intervention saved me from further harm, though I'm grateful for that every day. The real victory is that I chose to use my pain as a compass, pointing me toward the kind of person I wanted to become rather than letting it destroy me from the inside. I'm telling you this story today because I know there are people listening who recognize parts of it. Maybe you were the child who learned too early that trust can be broken by the people closest to you. Maybe you're the parent who suspects something but doesn't know how to act on that suspicion. Maybe you're the bystander who has noticed changes in someone you care about but haven't found the courage to speak up. If any part of my story resonates with you, if it brings up memories or feelings that you've been carrying alone, I want you to know that your experience matters. Your pain is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged. Whether it happened last week or 50 years ago, whether anyone believed you then or not, your truth has value. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that truth. That's not my decision to make. But I will tell you that keeping it locked away in silence rarely makes it hurt less. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply say, out loud or in writing, "This happened to me." Not necessarily to seek justice or confrontation, but just to stop carrying that burden completely alone. If you feel moved to share any part of your story in the comments below, please know that I read every single one, and so do many other people who understand, and please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to realize they're not alone, that they're not crazy, that what happened to them wasn't their fault. I'm Victoria Simons, and I want to leave you with something I've learned over these 80 years of living. Our memories, even the painful ones, are bridges. They connect who we were to who we've become. They link our past experiences to our present wisdom, and they help us reach across the space between ourselves and others who need to know they're not alone. Keep your memories close, even the difficult ones. They've brought you this far, and they have more to teach you yet. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting me break the silence one more time.